I wanted to address a question that somebody had asked if I had any resources on it. I know that I've done resources on this question in the past, but I figured I'd make a video about it since it's a question that's asked quite a bit. And that is the question of when Paul is writing in Romans and Galatians about justification apart from works of the law, what does he mean by works of the law? Does Paul just mean, in other words, that we are saved apart from ceremonial works of the law? Does he just mean that we're saved apart from the food laws, circumcision, those things which distinctively marked the people of Israel out as the descendants of Abraham? So then the question is, well, if that's true, if that's all Paul's talking about, then justification is not really apart from works in general, but simply those works of the law. This discussion has come up a lot in studies on Paul in recent years, but it's really an old discussion. There was a difference of opinion between St. Augustine and St. Jerome over this very issue. So the answer that I'm going to give, as a Lutheran of course, is that works of the law are not simply those ceremonial works, but refer to moral law in general. And how do I know that? Where do we get this from? And I think I would say there's probably about 5 reasons why we can definitely believe that when Paul is speaking of salvation apart from works, he's speaking about works in a general sense, not just the ceremonial works. And the first of those is that Paul specifically defines what some of those works are. And he does that in, for example, Romans 7, when he talks about what the law says and how the law has convicted him. And the example that he gives is the example of coveting. Now, clearly, coveting is a moral work. It's not even an external moral work. It's getting to an issue of the heart. Probably the one of the 10 Commandments that we probably think matters the least. That's the one Paul singles out. So in his exposition and understanding of the law, it's pretty clear that he cites the moral law as the 10 Commandments. The second reason is because when he talks about the condemnation of the law, he doesn't just point to the Jews. And he speaks about a universal nature of the law in things like Romans 3:20, when he says things like, well, that every mouth is stopped. The whole world would be held accountable to God. So both Romans and Galatians speak about this, that the condemnation of the law that Paul is talking about, or the works of the law, is something that is universal. So it's not limited to the nation of Israel, and therefore it is not simply those works which are the ceremonial works that are of the Jews. That might not be universal in the same sense that the moral law or the natural law would be. And the third argument would be that Paul speaks elsewhere pretty clearly about salvation apart from works in general. And so we look at texts like, Ephesians chapter 2, and we can look at the book of Titus and 1 Timothy. There are texts in all of these different places where Paul speaks about a salvation apart from works in general. Okay, so in Ephesians 2, that would be a great example, by grace through faith, not of works, lest anyone should boast. So it's clear that what's going on there, he's not just saying by grace through faith, not by ceremonial Jewish works, or not just by boasting in ethnicity, but clearly there's something broader than that. And then the fourth point I would bring up is something that's been brought up by a guy named Chris Vlachos. He's got a book on Paul and the law, which I believe was his dissertation, where he's dealing with a particular phrase where Paul connects, where Paul's speaking in 1 Corinthians 15 about how the sting of death, the sting of sin is the law, the power of sin is the law. And then he goes into an exposition of Romans 5 and other places in Paul's theology where it's pretty clear that in Romans 5, for example, he sees the law as something that's Edenic. So he connects the state of Israel under the law. He speaks about, the time of Adam and the time of Moses. That's why he excludes the time in between Adam and Moses. So Adam was given a law. Adam was given not ceremonial laws, but Adam was given moral laws. He was given moral commandments. And so if you look at the connection in Romans 5 between the law and how God created Adam in 1 Corinthians 15, you can make some of those connections as well. It's pretty clear that the law is something creational. It's something that belongs to all of humanity as Adam was created in the garden. And then the fifth and final point is simply that the earliest Christians who read Paul mostly understood him in this way as well. They understood that when he was talking about the works of the law, it was not excluded to Jewish ceremonial works. Now, there are different interpreters of Paul in the early church, and some take one position and some take another. As I said, Jerome would be an example of someone who sees it primarily as ceremonial works. But as you look at places like First Clement, it's pretty clear that he sees it not as simply ceremonial boundary markers or something like that. I actually wrote a book on this topic called The Righteousness of One, an evaluation of early patristic soteriology in light of the new perspective on Paul. It's kind of a mouthful, but that was my first book that I ever wrote in my master's thesis. So when looking at that, a lot of the earliest interpreters at least understood Paul in a way that's similar to Luther. And so what that tells us is not necessarily that it's correct, but what it does tell us is that it's not like Luther was reading something that was totally foreign to the early church. And many of the earliest interpreters of Paul saw the same things that I'm arguing for, that Luther would argue for as well. Because in a lot of these discussions we'll get into, people will say things, especially with Roman Catholics, or some in the new perspective on Paul, that Luther just made this interpretation of Paul up. That's not true. And you can go back to St. Augustine, and though he doesn't, quite adopt a purely legal understanding of justification as the later Protestant tradition was, there are a lot of similarities between his approach and that of Protestants, generally speaking. So anyway, I hope that helps. So those are 5 reasons why I think it's pretty clear that when Paul talks about works of the law, he is talking about good works in general, including the moral commandments, not simply ceremonial works. So thanks so much for watching. If you like this and want other content, like and comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. We'll see you next time. God bless.